There will be times when the struggle seems impossible. I know this already. Alone, unsure, dwarfed by the scale of the enemy. Remember this. Freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously and without instruction. Random acts of insurrection are occurring constantly throughout the galaxy. There are whole armies, battalions that have no idea that they've already enlisted in the cause. Remember that the frontier of the rebellion is everywhere, and even the smallest act of insurrection pushes our lines forward. And then remember this. The Imperial need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural. Tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks. It leaks. Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear. Remember that. And know this. The day will come when all these skirmishes and battles, these moments of defiance, will have flooded the banks of the Empire's authority, and then there will be one too many. One single thing will break the siege. Remember this. Try.
Hey, this is Mark A. Altman.
This is DAREN DOCHTERMAN.
And this is Ashley Miller.
And we are the Inglorious
Treksperts.
And today we're coming to you from Oklahoma City at GalaxyCon Oklahoma City with a live on-tape episode of Inglorious Treksperts.
We're live.
On tape.
We have the greatest audience you've ever seen here to listen to the podcast. They are just full of
Vim and vigor.
vim and vigor. That's what I was going to say.
Down, folks. We need to record this. No.
You're going to have to regulate.
And smiling, happy people.
That's because we haven't started yet.
It's a delightful thing. But today we thought it'd be interesting because it's very much in the zeitgeist right now to talk about where is Star Trek's Andor? And that may be a provocative question for some people who may say, I feel like Star Trek has had its Andor. You know, people might feel like that it's an ingenuous question. So when we raise the question, what do we mean when we say? Maybe we close those doors too. Would somebody please close that door? What do we mean? Thank you so much. We don't have any cool prizes, unfortunately. What do we mean when we say, "Where's Star Trek's Andor?" Ashley?
I interpret that as looking at Star Trek as a drama first. In the same way that you would look at any premium cable series. I'm loath to use the Game of Thrones analogy because I don't know that it's necessarily accurate or relevant to Trek. But the thing that makes Andor special is that it takes the Star Wars universe seriously as if it's a place that you can live. And it gets down into the nitty-gritty details of that world and how it works. And it sheds the romanticism. And it deconstructs it in a really interesting way that doesn't actually subvert Star Wars. It's just different. It's not making it different to be different. It's just somebody doing, a very interesting dramatic exercise to break Star Wars open and understand it in a way we haven't thought about it before. And I'd say the closest Star Trek's come to that is probably DS9.
Yeah, there's been a lot of pitting Star Wars against Star Trek over the years. Oh, I'm a Star Wars fan. You can't be a Star Trek fan if you're Star. I personally am a fan of both franchises, so I never understood the hate that some people have. But, of course, the great William Shatner, Carrie Fisher feud would not have existed without that. So thank you for that. But what do you think when we raise this question, DAREN? What does it mean? And do you think that Star Trek has had its Andor, hasn't had its Andor, needs its Andor, doesn't need its pain? What do you think?
As much as I enjoy Andor, I think that Star Wars didn't need Andor, and here's why. Andor is a very adult-themed. It's not an adventure; it's a drama. But I always thought that Star Wars was an adventure, sort of an escapist thing to get you away from real-life problems. And though it's an enjoyable sort of jog to go into this serious adult world taking place in the Star Wars universe, I don't necessarily think it's necessary. However, I think Star Trek does need that. and sort of more now than ever, because Star Trek used to be actually relevant to actual things happening in the surrounding world. And I think it's less so now, because they sort of taken this science fiction thing and sort of taken it into the fantasy realm, which I don't think feels as relevant, at least to me.
You know, it's interesting because obviously I couldn't disagree more strongly with a lot of what Darren said. I think Andor is incomparable dramatic achievement for television. It has made a sci-fi palatable for people who don't like the genre. It is redeemed Star Wars, which has been in a massive rut for a long time. It is remarkably well made, remarkably well written, and basically is not just about, well, in this case, you know, science fiction often is a glimpse into our future. Star Wars took place a long, long time ago, but what it really is using contemporary and history to tell a story about what is the very heart of the Star Wars franchise, which is rebellion against fascism. But I think that what Darren did say that is interesting, and I agree, is that Star Trek was always the show that was about something, whether you look at the original series or Next Generation, certainly Deep Space Nine, Voyager to a certain extent, and Star Trek seems to have forgotten that the axiom to boldly go. You see something like Strange New Worlds, which has a very elastic premise, but is often doing things like the musical, or this season the murder mystery, or things like that. And is it about something? Is it entertaining? For a lot of people, it's immensely entertaining. But is it about something? I don't really feel that way. And I miss when Star Trek was telling us stories that were either allegories or metaphor for things that were going on in our real world.
Well, I have come here to praise Star Trek and Star Wars, not to bury them. I also disagree with Darren, although I respect his opinion. But I disagree, for slightly different reasons. I think I have a better answer on what makes Andor special in the Star Wars universe. Andor is to Star Wars as the Battlestar Galactica reboot is to the 1978 Galactica.
No offense.
Yeah, no offense. It's simply a different way of looking at the material. And what I appreciate about it is that it doesn't feel the need to be another version of the thing that we saw. The responsibility that it has, just like any of these shows or any of the movies, is number one, to be good. Number two, to justify itself on its own merits. And if Andor's way into that is to say, we're a drama and this is what we're doing, great, just be good. What's not great is if you decide to do something that feels off concept and then it's shitty. Or frankly, if you decide to do something that's very on concept, but also isn't so hot. And I think that gets to your point about Strange New Worlds, whether it's entertaining at times or not. The idea that suddenly Star Trek is in this place where it's not really about anything, and Star Wars, at least sometimes, definitely not all the time, is attempting to be about something, is an interesting shift, but it's also a welcome one, right? I mean, not the part where Star Trek has suddenly got a lobotomy, but I mean, the part where Star Wars is trying to be about something. Right. I think it's an interesting shift. I don't want all of my Star Wars to be that way, but I like that there is Star Wars that is that.
Well, it's interesting because I quibble with people who would then point to Star Trek Picard Season 3 as fan service.
No.
Because I think it transcends that in such a strong way. A lot of recent Star Wars has been fan service, whereas Andor isn't. What Picard also shares with Andor is it really made an effort to understand its characters, and there was a complexity to our beloved Next Generation characters that hadn't existed certainly in a lot of the movies, but in many of the episodes. I mean, the relationship, obviously, between Riker and Troy and what they've gone through, the PTSD that Captain Todd Stashwick, you notice I say the actor's name, but I don't remember Captain
Shaw.
Captain Shaw, thank you.
You're welcome.
You think I would remember
Liam Shaw.
It's a reference to Jaws. How would I not, But Captain Shaw, the fact that Geordi initially is wary of helping his old comrades because he wants to protect his family. He's afraid of the consequences. Now, it doesn't go into the kind of depth that I think that Andor did, but it is a rich tapestry that Star Trek explored, I definitely want to see more of that because I feel like so many of the characters in Star Trek lately have just been ciphers or, one note without a lot of complexity to them.
You looked like you wanted a microphone.
No, but I'll take it anyway.
You take it. Look at you.
Look, the trouble with Star Trek, is that no one actually takes it seriously at the studio level. They think they want to expand it for more audience by making it sort of general sci-fi, and that is not something that that enables the franchise to grow at all. It sort of compresses that idea to make it palatable for more people. And I think that the fact that Andor exists is a lovely accident because I don't think anyone intended that way. I think that they were sort of just going for the, let's bring the handsome leading man into his own show and see what happens. I think that Tony Gilroy sort of took that idea and sort of expanded it enough with his own desires to produce a show that had some actual drama and meaning in it. And I think that was, he completely blindsided the people that were in charge, and I think they weren't expecting that. At least that's what I'm seeing.
No one authorized a good show.
No, actually, I mean, the point that DAREN is making is largely true because Andor began with the concept after Rogue One of being a buddy, basically a buddy cop show. It's, between Cassian and K2SO. And they thought, week to week they go on adventures. And it would be very similar to what Mando was between Mando and Grogu. And they hadn't quite licked it, and it was Tony Gilroy who had worked with Kathleen Kennedy on Bourne Identity and had done the surgery on Rogue One that turned Rogue One into a great movie. And it was Tony Gilroy who just said, this doesn't work. K2 is not a character that you can do anything with other than sparingly because he can solve every problem. It's writer's worst nightmare because he is, powerful. He's almost impossible to kill. And he's comic relief. So how do you make the show work? And he was the one who then gave them the manifesto that said this is what the show should be. It should really be about the nature of, rebellion. And everything that you have to sacrifice for the greater good. And, at first there was a lot of reluctance to do that. And eventually they came around to Tony's way of thinking. And it was that kind of show that he wanted to tell. And he's an immensely well-read person on history and on revolutions. And so much of what we see in that show, like the Gorman Uprising and stuff, are based on, real things. There's a reason that the... it's largely cast with French actors for the Gormans, and of course, there is those chilling scenes with the ISB, which evoke the Wannsee Conference as well. So I think that Tony Gilroy, and I said this recently, is to Star Wars what Nick Meyer was to Star Trek, because Tony Gilroy was not at all a Star Wars fan and didn't feel beholden to what had come before, but wanted to respect it. And that was kind of Nick Meyer on Star Trek when he came in and did Star Trek 2. He was the one who was very dismissive, who said, Star Trek's the one about the guy with the ears. That's, and he was also very, and still is, very pretentious. And I say that in a nice way. Super well read. He had written a best-selling a book about Sherlock Holmes, meaning Freud, and Sherlock Holmes was, addicted to cocaine. And
sometimes a microphone is just a microphone.
And so it was a very interesting, Nick was a very interesting person to put in charge of Star Trek. And, coming off of, Star Trek the Motion Picture, where even Robert Wise was and his family were Trek fluent, or knowledgeable about Trek. Nick Meyer was somebody who knew nothing about Star Trek. Harv Bennett, who produced it, really knew nothing about Star Trek, but then educated himself about Star Trek by watching what was then only, it seems so quaint now, 79 episodes to educate himself about Star Trek. And then they gave us a movie which, stands the time as one of the greatest Star Treks, if not the greatest Star Trek movies of all time. And they knew nothing about Star Trek, but they respected Star Trek. And that's kind of how I feel about Tony Gilroy and Andor, is that, he's not somebody, necessarily, and this is not to criticize Dave Filoni at all, but somebody who knows every decision that George Lucas made and why he made it and everything that's happened since, but respected Star Wars, that, didn't want to just ignore canon, but wanted to find clever ways to work within the canon to tell a story, and I think he's done that immensely successfully.
I think your Star Trek II analogy is really good on another level, because what Nick Meyer does in Star Trek II is he comes in and he reinterprets Star Trek, in part because he has to, right? He's got 12 days to write the script, to figure out the movie. He's got, he has what he has. He has to find the pieces, and he's presented with pieces of these other drafts and go, what is the movie in here? And then he has to filter it through his own taste, through his own point of view. But what the process requires of him for it to work is that he needs to be good, and he needs to actually have a point of view to filter it through. And that's what really sets Tony Gilroy apart in Andor. He doesn't just have a point of view to filter it through. He also has the talent that allows him to kind of build that filter around the pieces that he's handed. So again, to use the Battlestar Galactica analogy, it's like Ron Moore. Ron Moore interprets Battlestar Galactica, and that's why those things feel special, because what we're actually seeing is we are seeing a vision. We are not seeing somebody simply telling stories in the universe that are in fact fan service. I'm looking at you, Ahsoka. It's like even when there are things about the fan service that are fun and good, right, that we like. Look, there's a reason why they call it fan service, not fan slapping. I mean, like we like it sometimes. It's good to be served, just not all the time. And I think that's the way that we need to look at Andor. And in fact, I can't think of. Okay, I'm gonna throw something out. This is the part of the show where I make Mark go, "What?"
Okay, I'm ready.
Are you ready?
Bring it on, baby.
Okay. So.
What? Oh, sorry.
Damn it! You anticipated.
Okay, go ahead.
You came too soon. Here's my notion of what is currently the closest thing to Andor. Okay, putting aside the fact that yes, Picard, the drama, all that other shit, but something that is actually an interpretation.
If you say Lower Decks, I'm going to slap you.
You got it.
God damn it.
It's comedy. It's not drama, but it is somebody's very particular interpretation of the material with something to say about the material.
Listen, I have no problem with Lower Decks.
Right.
I think it's a very clever, smart show. The fact that you're comparing it to Andor makes me wonder if you're on drugs.
No. I'm not comparing it to Andor as a drama. I'm comparing it as
I know what you're attempting to do. Yes,
Yeah.
I get that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think it's
insane.
I just think it's insane. But it's you, so I cut you some slack. I think also Star Trek has been talked about as an anthology series. You talk to Bran and Braga, or you talk to many people. You see, what's great about Star Trek is how elastic the premise is. One week you can do, look at the movies. One week it's a comedy, one's a submarine movie, one's a search for God, but on the TV shows, one's a Western, one's this, one's that. So that's really interesting. And certainly that's the case. I think one of the things I love about Andor, one is a prison heist. One's a rather gold heist. One's a prison escape. One is a resistance movie. War resistance movie. I mean, so each arc, the 3-episode arcs, are very different, and I think that's part of the richness of the tapestry.
I think part of the real. I'll use words in a moment.
It's been a long day.
Anti-disestablishmentarianism.
No, one of the fascinating things about Andor is it takes out one of the basic elements that made Star Wars enjoyable, and that's the magical Jedi Knights.
Thank God.
There's no Jedi Knights in there. And I think that's an interesting way of dealing with this world without the swashbuckling, without the magic. And I think maybe Star Trek needs the same thing. I think that Star Trek might need
The magic is gone from Star Trek already.
well, no, but take out the space travel, make it just about living on a Klingon world and finding out more about their society, and that way you can do the direct sort of. Why are you raising your hand?
Say boring. That's boring as shit.
No, but it wouldn't be, because you do the full Jonathan Swift on it, and you do parallel stories from human development and translate them into the Klingon
Okay,
world.
and I'm going to hit you with a pitch.
Okay.
All right. So here's my pitch for doing exactly that. What you do is you posit a group of Starfleet officers, right? That's what we want. And we want to put them like on a world where almost every week we develop our understanding of that world and how the culture works on that world, who the people are, their connection to the problems of the Starfleet officers. Maybe what we do is, and I'm just spitballing, what if we put them on a space station? A deep space station. Maybe the 9th deep space station.
It doesn't go anywhere.
But it doesn't go anywhere. Right. I don't know. Maybe
No,
there's a wormhole.
but
and not just me.
you need to ground it literally by sort of making Dances with Wolves in Star Trek. You know, you
But
have
they're dances with targs.
sure.
Okay.
You have sort of one Starfleet officer who winds up somehow on an alien planet
With
and
Mary
he
McDonnell.
and he has to deal with the native
available.
aliens. You know?
Yeah.
And that can give us the human angle, it can give us the alien angle, and it give us some actual sort of interaction that actually means something in terms of the human story.
It's so funny when you hear Brannon talk about Enterprise that, whether it's apocryphal or not, he says it's not, that the plan had been for the whole first season to basically take place on Earth and have it more of a slow burn before they go into space. And, I think on one hand, that sounds awful, and on another hand, it sounds like, wow, that could have been really interesting if, as a way of getting to know the characters and getting excited about the characters before, and to get a sense of how dangerous that potentially that first mission was, because Enterprise, from its opening credits, wanted desperately to be the right stuff, but it never, you could say that the Manny years did, 4th season, but it never really achieved those lofty goals, and which is a shame, because the template was right there, but
Right in front of them.
it struggled to achieve that. But I think also another MVP on Andor that Star Trek hasn't had, because, quite honestly, we're judging on a curve, because Andor they're spending like $20 million an episode. They have an extraordinary amount of money. When you put the 3 episode arcs together, you basically have a feature film budget, But Luke Hall, who's the production designer who did Chernobyl, has done such an extraordinary job of creating a world that feels real and lived in, and they've eschewed using the volume as much as possible, and they use CGI for set enhancements and things, but it's so much more practical effects in that show. And when they're going to shoot, say, the Senate, they went to Valencia and they found these amazing architecture, and then they enhanced that with CGI, and it's extraordinary. So the whole idea of being immersed in a world is all there. It's all so perfect, because Luke Hall is just a brilliant production designer. What the achievement of that series is absolutely extraordinary. There's not one scene where I look at it and say, well, that's kind of fake. Whereas, unfortunately with Star Trek, which has a smaller budget, it certainly did, that's not necessarily the case, but I do think that Star Trek, the joy of Star Trek is it didn't need that huge budget to work. And what happens now with some of the newer shows is that it has a much bigger budget, and it's trying to be Star Trek 2009 rather than trying to be The Next Generation, or trying to be TOS, trying to be Deep Space Nine, which could work on a minuscule budget. Some of the best episodes were bottle shows.
Yep.
So, But I want to ask you guys, when you hear this, like you've been watching, and by the way, he has not finished Andor, so no spoilers.
No spoilers.
Please, this will be very upset, and you wouldn't like him when he's angry. Well, that was yesterday.
That was yesterday. Yeah.
Watch Rogue One.
But
Yeah.
but I'd love to know, kind of, do you agree with the essential thesis of what we're postulating, or do you feel that Star Trek has achieved those lofty heights lately, or that maybe Andor isn't your cup of tea? Just be interested in hearing kind of your perspective on the state of the franchises, the two towering franchises. And by the way, I do want to say to our Galactica friend here, having written the book on Battlestar Galactica, where we covered the original and the new show, I am fans of both, and you can live in peace and not have to hate one or the other. I think the 78 version I love for what it was, and I love the Ron Moore version for what it is. So, but it was so funny. We get hate mail. The publisher would get hate mail saying, "How could you have that Ron Moore abomination in the book with the original series, or how could you put that original series shit in with the Ron Moore classic?" So it's very funny. As people are very passionate about this stuff. So we don't have a mic, but if you want to speak up loudly, is there anybody who wants to share some thoughts about how they feel about this sort of franchise square off?
No, apparently.
Not even Q? The trial never ends, man.
You just appeared out of nowhere, didn't you? You just sort of popped up. That's terrific. I love that answer. That's actually a really good answer to a lot of different questions, now that I think about it. Yeah.
But
well, I'll throw something out that just in terms of how we look at what makes Andor different. I mean, there's and again, this kind of applies to all of the examples of shows we're talking about. There's a postmodern quality to Andor, where Tony Gilroy, when he's taking away the magic, right? He's deconstructing Star Wars in a really interesting way. He's actually kind of asking, okay, what makes this Star Wars shit tick, right? Because you're basically talking about a story about the battle between good and evil. Well, great. What does that mean? Show me good. Show me evil. Let's take it apart. Like, let's see how that works. Again, you look at Deep Space Nine, which took these Starfleet officers who were living in this Roddenberryan ideal, and then you plunk them down into a society that said, gosh, that's nice, but we live in the real world where things suck, and so do you. And you wind up with a show where the thesis is it's easy to be a saint in paradise, right? It's postmodern. It's deconstructing it, just the way that, that Ron Moore's Battlestar Galactica deconstructed Galactica. And just a really smart way. And I think there's some value in what you said about taking away those things, right, that are almost the hamburger helper for the show, like Andor taking away the Jedi, and DS9 taking away the starship, even though I put one back.
I just want to say, because we're going to avoid spoilers, that the Force is not completely gone from Andor.
Well, that's that's okay. Yeah. Don't tell me, but yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you.
It's lovely and tasteful. Okay.
Mostly.
Now
Mostly.
The other thing,
The Jedi only come out at night. Mostly.
The other thing that is so successful about Andor is probably every character in the show is more interesting than the title character. And that's not to say the title character isn't interesting, but whether it's Cyril or Dedra or Lonnie or any of the characters, each one has a complex backstory and is really compelling. Now, I'm going to compare that, and this is not to slag on Discovery. This is not like just saying, "Oh, Discovery sucked." But if you look at this,
said it.
No, I'm just saying. But if you look at Discovery, you have Michelle, who has a kind of rich. Michael, who has a rich, backstory, whether you like it or not, and you could say that.
Saru.
Thank you. That he has a complex story. But then you go to the bridge crew, and after 7 years, I still don't know their names or anything about them.
Right.
Right.
Which is fine if it's the original Star Trek when they were just supposed to be day players.
Right. But this was supposed to be an ensemble, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about the original Star Trek is it was about the three leads. It was always a star vehicle, not ensemble, that the later shows would become. It was about Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and so that's fine if we don't know a lot about Sulu or a lot about Chekhov. It's fine for everybody except for George and Nichelle, who want more to do. But but that's okay. But Andor, it's like everybody down to Cyril's mother is a fascinating character. I mean, and look at the arc. Well, you don't, but Stellan Skarsgård's Elizabeth Dulu goes through is remarkable. So. it just that's really to me. How do you make Star Trek Andor? Yes, it can't be Andor, but what it needs to be is really go back to what makes Star Trek work for all these years, which is character, and really explore the character in a deeper way, and not just the biggest trick the devil ever played was to convince the showrunners of Star Trek that Star Trek was Star Trek 2009 and not all the shows that preceded it. And whether you love Star Trek 2009, which is totally fine, legitimate, it's a rollicking good fun. It's not the template for a TV series.
No,
it's a
not.
template for a movie series. So to use that as your guidepost is doing Trek a disservice, I think.
Yeah, and the other thing is that Star Trek always needs sort of real character interactions, real, how would a real person exist in this environment, and how would they react to the things that happen to them?
I warned you from the start.
I just can't believe it. I've known him my whole life.
People fade. That's our curse. What would have happened if I wasn't here? Would you have told me?
I'm meeting him next week. Yes, I would have told you. I'll warn him off. I'll find what it takes. I'll get a number.
You know the number. We'd be vulnerable forever. You need to be protected.
I'm not sure what you're saying.
How nice for you.
And the reason that you need that is because, it's not just about seeing yourself in an episode. That's not what it is. And when you get that, sometimes you get characters that don't belong in Star Trek at all, because the point, at least of the earlier Star Trek, is to want to be more like these people that we're seeing in the show, and better ourselves to be more like them. And without that, it sort of loses its ability to inspire us to be better and to try and react like these quote unquote more evolved humans would react.
You're talking about the aspirational nature of Star Trek. And the aspirational aspect of Star Trek is something that you can't, particularly now, you can't dismiss. It is so important. People watch Star Trek, for empathy, for to understand that the future could be a better place. It basically told us xenophobia was bad, and that one day the future would be better when humanity works together. And that's an element of Star Trek that kind of they're not hitting very hard anymore. Maybe Lower Decks is, but most of the shows have sort of moved away from that, and I think that has hurt Star Trek. Without a doubt. I would also say, pick up on something you said. What I love about Andor 2 is, and I can vouch for this, you could watch Andor and then Rogue One and then Star Wars. I'm not going to call it A New Hope, Star Wars, and it all is of a piece. Nothing is jarring that you're like, oh, this doesn't fit or it feels out of time or out of place with what you've just watched. It actually comes together very modularly and plays beautifully together as its own trilogy, Andor and Rogue One and Star Wars. And unfortunately, Star Trek's not the same. You can't watch the Golden Age, Silver Age of Star Trek and the modern age of Star Trek and have it feel seamless, because obviously Strange New Worlds does not feel like The Cage. Discovery does not feel like TOS. Even being set in those eras, Picard doesn't really feel like Next Generation until the third season. So it's very unbalanced in that way. If you're somebody who looks at this as future history and lives and breathes Star Trek as future history and values canon, it doesn't really. It's certainly visual canon, not, and then
Usually visual canon
doesn't connect.
Kind of to you guys and your point about the aspirational nature. I'm going to differ only slightly, and I'm maybe in some sense I'm the cynic of the show, but I don't know that I ever bought into Gene's marketing about Star Trek, and how our heroes were evolved humans. I think that what was powerful about Star Trek, especially we hate calling it the original series. Like, we keep vowing that we're only going to call it Star Trek and that's it, but then suddenly we're qualifying it and we're calling it that.
Well, just to convey, because people don't know, it's like when I say Star Wars and Not New Hope, they mean which one?
Right,
No,
exactly.
I mean,
Star Wars. Yeah, so Star Trek. In Star Trek, Captain Kirk was a complicated dude, and nobody understood him but his woman. No, wait, that's Shep. Captain Kirk was a very complicated guy. He did things that were like a little eyebrow raising. He was not always perfect. He got pissed off. He acted out of anger. But the thing that was different about him was not that he was soy or vanilla. What was different about him is, all right, so there's this whole thing and you guys are going to go, Ashley, here you go again. But bear with me. What makes a romance is that there's always a happily ever after. Okay. Characters can go through a lot of shit, but at the end of the day, there needs to be a happily ever after. What makes the characters on Star Trek is that they can do almost anything, go through almost anything, make all the mistakes, make all the difficult choices, but at the end of the day, even if they wind up doing something that feels awful, and I'm looking at you in the pale moonlight, it still leaves us with the sense that they grew, that they tried to make the best choice they possibly could under the most difficult circumstances, and that's what we should aspire to. I can't aspire to be a freaking robot, but what I can aspire to be is somebody who says, wow, here's something terrible that I have to deal with, and maybe I'll make mistakes, but then I can recognize them, and I can correct them, and I can decide I will not kill today.
Well, you can aspire to be as sensitive as the robot to what human beings have to deal with.
Right.
And you can aspire to learning as much as you can. And I think the hyper-evolved humans, that doesn't make any sense for me either.
Yeah.
That and Gene sort of talked about that later in the Star Trek canon.
Yeah.
But what is important is that all the characters are in their positions for a reason, because they are really good at what they do. They are very qualified to be on a starship, and they are the representative of humanity out where no man has gone before.
Trying to do their best.
Yeah, yeah. And yes, Kirk is complex because he has self-doubt. He has concerns over, is he doing the right thing? But the great thing about that is that he has his sounding boards around him, Spock and McCoy, who help him get through these situations and become a whole person.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure, actually, what point you were countering when you said the evolved humans, because the only person who ever said that was Gene Roddenberry in the Next Generation era, when he was saying, oh, people don't fight, people don't have conflict, which we all know is bullshit.
Ridiculous, yeah.
The reason Star Trek's aspirational is for exactly the reasons you articulated. These are characters who are trying to do the best, but they have foibles and failings. I mean, McCoy will needle Spock. Spock is a man of immense passions, who suppresses all of them, who can't admit to emotions, even if he's emotional. Kirk is a guy who will often do the wrong thing, but is big enough to admit it. Look at Arena, where he wants to kill the Gorn, and it's only at the last second that he stops himself, and or where he's arguing for war and Taste of Armageddon. He says we admit we're a killer species, but we're not going to kill today. Kirk is not perfect, but he is willing to admit that he makes mistakes, errand of mercy, all these things. So it's the same thing. That was the Achilles heel we know of Next Generation, and why in a lot of ways Picard Season 3 was so successful, because a lot of the Roddenberry edicts, the moratorium on conflict between the characters, was abandoned.
Yep.
And you saw what happened when these characters actually had conflict, and it was very rich. I mean, that was something that Terry did very effectively, because the writers on Next Generation were handcuffed. Now, did some remarkably great episodes, but it made it hard to develop a lot of those characters because they were not allowed to have conflict. But all these shows, including especially Deep Space Nine, were aspirational. Yeah. No matter how flawed the characters were, they were all struggling, except for Baby Quark, to be better, to do better.
Even Quark in his own way.
You know, and even Quark, because, you know, he might be express cowardice, but then he would do the right thing to save his brother, begrudgingly. Yeah, so...
but you know what, though? I mean, forgive me, but I think you actually just made an excellent case for a pretty good answer to the question behind this very panel. Where is Star Trek's Andor? I know what Star Trek's Andor is. Star Trek. That's the answer.
Do Star Trek.
You do Star Trek, right? So what's the difference? I mean, yeah, it's the 60s. It's, you know, you obviously have a very different production environment. You have, like, different tools to make the shows. So you have, like, you know, there's so many things that are different about how you would make television then. But in its own way, Star Trek advanced what science fiction storytelling could be on television in the same way that Andor advances that. Star Trek was something new under the sun, just like Andor is something new under the sun. And, you know, even though obviously, you know, the characters in Andor are incredibly complex. And, you know, you find yourself rooting for, like, some of the people in the ISB, for God's sake, even in spite of yourself. And there's a whole list of psychological reasons why that would be true. They're all still existing inside of, I think, Tony Gilroy's desire to tell a story about what it's like to struggle with the impulse to be good or to be evil. And what does that mean for you? And what does that make you? And how does your struggle to be good make you evil, Saw Gerrera?
Well, you know, it's the Rhino. But it's so interesting, one of the things you said there, which is true. You know, Star Trek in '66 was so groundbreaking because there had been all these dopey sci-fi shows like, you know, Lost in Space and Space Patrol, and Star Trek came along and there had been nothing like it. There were these really rich characters, you know, an alien who didn't have emotions, who had pointed ears, and these brilliant sets, you know, we had and miniatures and special effects. We'd never seen anything like it. Not that I was alive, but I'm putting myself.
I definitely never saw anything like it.
I'm pretending I was.
Yeah.
So, you know, and Andor was the same way. It took something that had been done, you know, obviously better, but in a really great way, but then took it and made it even more sophisticated. Said, well, what if this stuff was real? You know, what if this rebellion were real? What would it take to get to this point? You know, what would, you know, and then really sort of deconstructs it all and explores it in a much more complex, deeper way that is just absolutely extraordinary. But in that sense, it's very similar. You know, Star Trek started that way, but, you know, Star Wars, it took, because it's interesting, but Star Trek was a Star Wars, we all know, was a fairy tale, and a brilliantly told fairy tale, and that's why it endured for as long as it did. But fairy tales evolve. Like, look at, you know, what is it, Brothers Grimm. Those stories are so different than the way we tell them now, or the way Disney would tell those stories. So Star Wars evolves, and it's gone in different directions. Andor is just an evolved, you know, extension of what Star Wars was. I certainly wouldn't say it's a fairy tale, but it is the story, you know, for our times, you know, which is, it's so, the accomplishment of Andor is so extraordinary that, I mean, it's just like, I don't mind talking about in the same breath as the original Star Trek, because they're both equally groundbreaking in my...
For sure. And Star Trek has become everything that Star Trek was a reaction against. Before the original, see, this is why we got to call it the original series or any of that crap. You were going to say something, Darren. That guy has his hand up, which is crazy.
Oh, let's talk
Wait.
to this person.
Oh, way in the back there. Yeah, okay.
I kind of want to talk, because when you guys were discussing it, it seems like...
Wait, you want to come up and take the mic? Because
that way we can record it, we
and
can hear
no one's
you.
going to hear it. It sounds like you got a treatise.
It's like Charlie Brown's teacher back there. It's,
Yeah, you'll be like...
wah, 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 wah.
Here you go. Oh, you got the Star Trek shirt on, so we know which side of the debate you
Exactly. But when you guys were talking, it seemed like that, in a way, with these complex character stories, there's still so much simplicity within the center point of the storyline. And in the same way as the original series, in terms of, yes, we had these three main characters that had complex stories, but at the end of the day, everybody knew at the end of the episode that there was a humanitarian perspective to it. And I kind of feel like that Andor is the same way. And so, you know, maybe with what we're starting to see with all these new franchises coming through, Star Trek and Star Wars, that maybe just the over complexity of the storyline, even though the characters are complex, trying to compound that with the complexity of the storyline might be just getting everybody kind of out of whack. And if we went back to having that more simplified center at the end where everybody knew this is what we're trying to get through xenophobia or make peace not war, might be able to bring us back to kind of what Andor's trying to tell everybody, Star Trek, Star Wars, all the different franchises.
That's very astute. There's a thing like when it's about 10 or 15 years ago when we were in this place where like Lost starts out great and then it goes to shit, or Heroes starts out great and then it goes to shit. And I had a phrase that I would use to describe what happens to a great show at some point when it starts becoming about itself, is that it jumps up its own asshole. And there is a point where these things start to jump up their own asshole. They become about what they're about. So you can look at Ahsoka again.
Next week's panel. When does Star Trek
jump up its own asshole? Its own Ahsoka. There's definitely there are good things in Ahsoka. There are things I really liked about it. One of them died, but there's also just this sense that it's a Star Wars show about Star Wars. And that's kind of wrong. And that kind of gets to your point about how, well, now it's just sort of about the thing and it feels closed off and you can't follow it and it's not actually about anything.
I thought the point he made was very interesting, and not that, hopefully this isn't a spoiler for you, but, they do get the Death Star plans to the rebellion.
Did that Manny Bothans guy die?
And blow up the Death Star. That's the Jedi
Oh,
style.
okay.
Why do people keep making that mistake?
Because I like to say Manny Bothans and talk about him like he's a dude.
There's all these people who are like, oh, how do the Bothans figure into this? It's like, that was the second Death Star.
I know.
Okay, so anyway, now you've distracted
I'm so sorry.
But I was going to say, the point that he makes is, you're taking a simplistic premise, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but it's like and dealing with it in a much more complex fashion, and that is something Star Trek has been very successful. It's taking very simplistic kind of morality tales, but dealing it in a more sophisticated way. And I think to a certain extent, Star Wars, does that as well. I mean, if anything, the thing that comes out of Andor is that the sacrifices that people make, for the greater good, that's greater than themselves. It's like that brilliant monologue that Stellan Skarsgård gives.
Yeah, the Luthen rail speech.
Season, the
Amazing
Luthen monologue.
And what do you sacrifice?
Calm. Kindness, kinship. Love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago from which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, they set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything!
Amazing.
Well, I just a point of order, Your Honor. I think that
Good one.
I think that the funny thing about the sort of Star Wars timeline is that you have to assume that the Death Star 2 was being built almost around the same time as Death Star 1, because why have one Death Star when you can have two at twice the price?
Right.
But I would have loved to have seen a scene where the people building the second Death Star find out that the first one's been exploded, and they go, "Are we going to have a job? How are we going to? we need to cover up this exhaust port right now. And so you see guys covering up the exhaust port, and then you pull out and realize, oh, most of the skin is not on the Death Star. So it's a little bit moot.
Star Wars maintenance.
Yeah, right. It's just things that I
Like
think
damage
about.
Control?
Yeah.
You know, the maintenance crew that goes up and repairs these things. It's the Star Wars Lower Decks.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to watch that one either. No, I actually really like Lower Decks. I don't know why I'm bagging on it. Yeah, it's interesting. And I think at the end of the day, these conversations are sort of moot, but they come out of a good place, which is we care so deeply about these franchises that we want them to be good. We want them to be special. We want them to be important. I mean, I think it's incredible to see, the reaction to Andor, critically. Obviously you see, hopefully there are a lot of Emmy nominations potentially will come out of it.
It's not viewership, that's for sure.
Well, I think that's a misnomer. I don't think that's true. I think that the viewership isn't as high as some of the other initial Star Wars shows, but it is not also not doing well.
Yeah, and it's also not. It also doesn't have the same subscriber base, which has basically fallen like 50%.
Yeah, right. Since Mandalorian premiered. Plus, also there's been a lot of mediocre Star Wars since that makes. But the second season premiered very strong because there was a lot of built-up anticipation. Plus, I think with these shows, a lot of people wait to watch them.
Yeah,
it's not necessarily like they watch them. Yeah, you clearly.
Clearly,
Yeah,
yeah.
they don't watch them that first week, particularly with the way that Disney chose to release them as the 3-episode arcs, which was very smart. But I think for some people, they can't come home on a Tuesday and then watch what's basically a 2-hour movie.
Yep.
So they say, okay, I'm going to wait until they're all out, and then I'm going to watch them. So I don't think Disney in any way feels that it was the money that was not spent wisely. I do think what would have been a problem is originally Tony Gilroy's plan to do this in 5 seasons, and then they changed it to 2 seasons. I don't know if they would have ever finished it because the economics of these shows have changed so drastically since Andor was first greenlit. We only have a few minutes left, so yes.
I think one of the things that makes Andor so significant is that it has an endpoint.
Just speak loud.
Okay. So Andor has an endpoint. So it has the story it needs to tell, and then it ends. So I think to your point of what Star Trek's Andor, Star Trek needs a story that they can wrap up in 3 seasons, and that whole show is just about that thing.
It doesn't need an Andor; it needs an Endor. Star Wars also has an Endor now that I think about it.
Good. But,
Not anymore.
No, that's a really interesting point too, and I think that was what was so effective about the 3-episode arcs, which was you'd have like the prison arc, it would have beginning, middle, and end, or you would have the Aldhani raid, which is beginning, middle, or end. And Star Trek is so different because it's anthology series, and that seems to be something that people have really responded to in Strange New Worlds, that rather than being something super serialized like Discovery, it's a throwback to the older era of Star Treks where there's not really a mythology, it's more standalone stories. But you're right, it doesn't lead to anything. None of these shows lead anywhere. And that was, I think, part of a lot of people were intrigued by, how does Andor tie in with Rogue One? How are they going to stick the landing so it doesn't conflict anything? And if you've watched Andor and then Rogue One back to back, it's really remarkable how seamless that all is. I mean, there are a couple little things, and Tony Gilroy has said, the comment about, he says, I've never been in a prison before. Okay, well, he had no idea when he wrote Rogue One that there was going to be a 3-episode prison arc on Andor, but and he says
Maybe he just doesn't like to talk about his time in prison.
He doesn't like to reveal him, which is fine. I totally buy that.
Because of the whole thing with the Shiv.
What, they should not do a prison arc because there's one line in Rogue One that he's never been in prison before? No. So I think that, but I think that's true. And, it's like with Star, partially, and this is a different discussion, partially the problem with Star Trek is they've been so mired in sticking to the 23rd, 24th century, even with the new shows where they're trying to bring in new viewers, but yet going back to eras that have been well-trodden and that we kind of know what they are. And so there's a disconnect because people who grew up on the original series and Next Generation are like, well, the Spock didn't have a sister and all this stuff. And they were so wary initially of going anywhere new. And Star Trek, in its very tagline, is to boldly go where no one has gone before. And yet there was not really the stories of the 26th century. They jumped to the 31st eventually, but there wasn't a sense of Star Trek sort of moving forward and showing us things we hadn't seen before.
Yeah, I agreed. And I think that, some of the things that are most, like I said before, the most effective about Andor is that it has taken away the sort of magic space Jedi out of it. And I think that's one of the least believable things in Rogue One, is that the end scene with Vader, though it's way cool, I understand, it's way cool seeing Vader slice up all these rebels. But then when you go to Star Wars, why isn't he doing the same thing in the Rebel blockade runner? Why isn't he just waltzing through killing people?
He doesn't need to.
But he doesn't need to in Rogue One.
Sure he does.
No.
He's trying to get to the plane.
No. He could throw his hand across the hall and choke the guy, and
Now
you're
that
done.
he has good grip strength.
That's right. He's been working out. He's been doing lateral raises and shit.
He's not letting that floppy disk out of his hand.
So
No,
Captain
I
Pike
disagree.
should have a lightsaber, is what I'm saying.
I don't think that's the answer.
No.
But yeah, look, I don't know, if you've all seen Andor, if you haven't, maybe you don't have Disney Plus. It's really just sensational, and it just so deepens and enriches the Star Wars universe. There's so much we learn about the ISB and about and Luthen Rail is one of the most complex, interesting characters, and when you finish it, you'll see it's true.
I mean, I believe it. Yeah. He's one of my favorite characters, even just from the first season.
I mean, I haven't gone back and watched a show more than once, because I've watched it like 5 times already, and I'm going to one of the screenings, the FYC for your consideration screenings. When I get back to LA. I'm going to watch it on the big screen. I can't wait.
Nice.
So, so and I want to feel that way about Star Trek. Although I have to say, with Picard season 3, I think I watched them like twice.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So there was that I had all the feels again.
Yeah.
So to speak. So what's the answer to our question that we posited at the very beginning? Do you see a Star Trek Andor in the future?
Well, it's certainly conceivable. I think as currently structured, I would say no.
That's the polite word for it.
I think the closest that it came specifically is probably DS9, but I do think that I would stand by and defend the answer that Star Trek, like at its best, is Star Trek's Andor.
Well, I mean, and you made the case very early on,
Yeah.
Space Nine.
Yeah.
Deep Space Nine took Star Trek and dealt with it in a lot more complex ways than it had ever been dealt with. And at its best, Deep Space Nine is, top flight television.
Yeah.
Perhaps we already got Star Trek's Andor, and we don't get any more.
That's right.
Captain America.
So, I wonder if possibly revisiting the time period of the first Enterprise, where they get into the introductory, the start of the Federation.
Okay,
So do Enterprise, but good.
Yeah. So he was just saying that it would be interesting to explore the founding of the Federation, which was sort of at the very end of Enterprise. Now, the new movie that's in development, whether or not it ever sees the light of projector bulb, basically Paramount is in the process of doing what they call Star Trek Independence Day. It's like basically the Romulan War on Earth. And there are a lot of references to Enterprise and to that period that you're talking about. But the idea is to bring in new fans and sort of, clear the decks and sort of make something that anyone could come and not have to come with all this knowledge of Star Trek to appreciate. Whether that's good or not, I have no idea. I know that the screenwriter listens to our show, so I'm not going to say anything one way or the other. I always say I'm Fox Mulder. I want to believe. I keep an open mind. I'm very excited about everything until I've seen it. So I don't want to cast aspersions. I hope it's fantastic. We don't go in, go to the theater wanting to tear things down or not like things. It's like I want to believe. So I'm hoping it's great. I have concerns, but you know what? Maybe it's going to be fantastic. And that would be great, you know, because I don't want to see Star Trek ossify and go away, where it's not bringing in any new fans. There's no life to it, and people, you know, abandon it, goes away. Star Wars isn't going anywhere. But Star Trek, in the next 10 years, if they don't have a show that really hits a new audience and attracts people and gets, you know, a lot of excitement, I don't know how long Star Trek will continue. It's 60 years old. And that's when you start to feel the, you know, the muscles and everything start to atrophy. And, you know, 60 is a key age. So
Starting to get letters from the AARP.
yeah, you get your AARP card.
Right.
So
He needs a prostate exam.
You know, Star Wars is only 50. So so we'll see. But it's an interesting question. But of course, and if you're interested in conversations like this, or not, you can listen to Inglorious Treksperts every Thursday, wherever you listen to podcasts, and now even on YouTube. And, of course, you can subscribe at TrekspertsPlus.com. Our sister podcast, The 430 Movie, where we talk movies every week, and Deck 78, which is Star Trek-adjacent topics. So we hope you'll join us, and we're deeply grateful to our friends at GalaxyCon for once again inviting us to another great GalaxyCon here in Oklahoma City, and we're appreciative to you for being such a great audience over this last hour as we talked about Star Wars and Star Trek, and we put chocolate in our peanut butter apparently. So
Or peanut butter in our
and
chocolate.
we hope to see you. We hope to see you again soon. So keep on trekking, ingloriously, of course.